get started. Schedule for today is pretty straightforward. For the first hour, we're going to go over the new material of Chapter 6. Then we've got a guest speaker, Pike Rowley, from Avis & Young is going to come in for about an hour. And after that, we'll have a test from 10 until noon. Now at 10, my plan is to do any sort of last minute questions that you've got about the old material before we do the test. So, we may take a few minutes to kind of do whatever review that you've got questions about, and then we'll do the test. It should be more than enough time for the test. It's 20 questions, and heavily weighted toward actually the first quiz. So, all right.
Thank you, Dr. Floyd. You realize your excitement is going to just pop it off. Yeah. I mean,
okay, I've got 8 o'clock. All right, so the first topic for today out of Chapter 6 is incremental cost of borrowing. So this topic basically boils down to, you go to a lender, maybe you already have a loan, or they are offering you a couple of different options with regard to loans that they maybe have available. And so let's just say that you go in and the loan that they've got available for you is an $80,000 loan. And for simplicity's sake, we'll say that that is, in essence, 80% loan-to-value ratio. So the value of the property is actually, let's say, $100,000. And what they say is, okay, for that $80,000 loan, or 80% sort of loan-to-value, we're willing to give you that loan at maybe a 5% interest rate. And the term is, let's say, 15 years. Okay, so far, nothing new. All right, we go ahead and we solve, we get the payment. All right, so let's do that real quick. All right, so we get a monthly payment on this loan of $632.63. Okay, so once again, nothing new yet. All right. So this loan, like I said, either you have this loan or you've gone into the lender and this is one of the loans that they have on offer. Okay. Once again, we're sort of saying that's maybe 80% of the value of the property. And then they say, okay, we will actually lend you the full value of the property, or $100,000 as a separate loan, also for 15 years. But the interest rate on this loan is going to be higher. Now, first of all, before we do any more of the calculations, let's just stop and think about this for a second. All right? If you're a lender, and we're sort of saying this is the same property, okay? Same property, but two different loans. You've got two choices. Either you're going to get an 80% loan-to-value ratio or potentially 100% loan-to-value ratio, which means you have to put in no equity, so it's all, just basically just a 100% bank loan, all right? Now, why, or in your mind, what interest rate, or what kind of interest rate would they charge you on the 100% loan? Would it be higher or lower or the same? Higher. Why? Because the risk the bank is undertaking from the standpoint that what happens if, a year or two or whatever into the loan, all of a sudden you're not able to make the payments, they've got to foreclose on the property, and, and once they foreclose on the property, then obviously they've got to go through the sale of disposing of the property, and they're going to have costs associated with that disposal. Well, that's really the big reason why, in most instances, lenders want to have that loan-to-value ratio of maybe somewhere around 80 or so %, is because they know that they're going to have costs that they're going to incur, and they don't want to have to be out of pocket for those, okay? So very seldom do they really ever want to give, obviously anywhere close to 100% loan. Now, are there lenders that give 100% loan to value? Yeah, there are. But you typically have to pay more for them, okay? Because there's a risk associated with them. But you're about to find out something that you probably didn't think about. All right, so let's just say that the interest rate on the full 100,000 is 8%. So let's go ahead and calculate the payment on that for a second. Okay, so if I just simply asked you, without doing any calculations here for a second, what's my incremental cost of borrowing? How would you define it? How would you explain it?
The difference between those two?
Okay, the difference between the two, that's a good start. What else?
Well, you have to take into consideration the amount of money you don't put down, right?
To a certain extent, yes, but let's get past that.
Incremental increase in the interest rate?
Okay, the incremental increase in the interest rate. Well, at first blush, the first thing that would come to your mind is you're paying 3% more. Yes? That's the first thing that comes to your mind, but that is wrong.
3% more and 20,000 more.
It's actually 3% more on the whole amount, okay? Because in this one, you're only paying 5% for 80 grand, whereas that one, you're paying 8% on the entire 100,000, okay? So what we're actually going to be calculating is what is the incremental cost of borrowing, meaning for that extra $20,000, how much are you really paying on that extra $20,000? Because here's the thing, could you not potentially go to a third lender or a second lender and say, all right, I just need to borrow 20 grand? Okay, well let's just first of all see what that actual difference is. All right, think about how you would do it. All you really need to do is just first of all, take the difference between the payments. Let's start with that. Okay. So let's think about this for a second. There's a $323 difference between the two payments. Okay, everybody sees that, yes? Well, one way to look at that is that $323 is really the additional cost to borrow the 20 grand. Yes? Yes, it is. Okay, all right? So how would we then set that up? Well, go over here, put in 323.02 as our payment. Put in, and you can put that in as a negative or a positive, depending on, because we need to put the 20,000 difference in as the opposite. So let's just go ahead and put this in as a negative. And we'll put this in as a positive. But one of them has to be a negative in order for everything to work. And then 15-year term. And then solve for the interest rate, which is going to be your incremental cost of borrowing of the 20,000. Yeah, exactly. So to borrow that extra 20 grand, you're actually paying about 18% on that extra 20 grand. So in other words, here's what you could have done. You could have taken the first loan of the 80 grand at 5% and then gone to some other third-party lender, like you could even go into like a credit card, for that matter, as long as the interest rate were something less than 18%, it would have been a good deal for you to potentially, find another alternative, okay? Or you simply accept this and just realize that for that extra 20 grand, you're actually paying an 18% interest rate. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Yep.
Are there like services that you could, if you do that, where you take out two different loans, where you can lump them together?
Yes. And we're going to talk about that.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Other questions on this, though? I mean, is there anything about it that doesn't make sense to you? So why would the lender do it this way? Why would they package them together? In other words, or why would they just simply give you that overall 8%? Because this sounds a whole lot better than, in essence, giving you two different loans, one at 18% and then the other at 5%.
Yeah.
But that's also what happens in reality in a lot of cases, is that you have your primary lender, in essence, giving you that really low interest rate, but then you have a secondary lender that takes a junior position or a junior mortgage at a much higher interest rate. But then you can have them blended together in what is called a wrap loan, which we're going to get to a little bit later. Okay? All right. Other questions? That was easy. All right. Let's move on. Okay. PMI, private mortgage insurance. I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about this because this, once again, is purely residential, and those of you that have been involved in residential transactions probably know as much about this as I do. But PMI, for the most part, is this. If you go into a residential lender and you are able to get an 80% loan-to-value loan on your home, you don't have to get private mortgage insurance. Because once again, the thought process is there that if the home gets foreclosed on, the lender sort of feels like they've got enough of a gap between what the market value of the property is and what they lent you on the property, that 20% sort of cushion between the 100% and the 80%, to not necessarily be overly concerned. Well, if you borrow above 80% loan-to-value ratio, you're typically going to be required to get private mortgage insurance, which is simply a fee that you're going to have to pay. It's basically an insurance policy that is going to cover the losses incurred by the lender in the event of a default. Okay, does that make sense? Now, you can also, whenever you go out and you borrow more than 80%, you're typically going to have a secondary lender, and that interest rate on that loan is typically going to be higher, just like we were talking about the incremental cost of borrowing. But it's like on top of that, you're also going to have a fee, a monthly fee for the private mortgage insurance, okay? Which, maybe whatever it is, $20, $30, $50 or more, depending on the size of the property, that sort of thing. Okay, so it's just an additional cost of borrowing, but would need to be factored in to basically your overall cost of borrowing. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Possibly could be. Okay. So, let's just sort of start out with relatively straightforward scenario. So once again, we're going to make the assumption that we have got an 80% loan to value to start with. Okay, and the interest rate on this, I don't know, let's just make it 6%. And make it for 20 years. Okay, so we'll start with this. Okay, so our monthly payment, $573.14. Okay, now, we're also, on top of this, going to get sort of a secondary mortgage And so the secondary mortgage doesn't have to be the full, you know, 20,000 to bring it up to maybe the whole $100,000 of the property. It could be something less than that. It could be 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, whatever we want it to be, but anything above and beyond the 80%, we've got to sort of factor that in. So what dollar amount would we want it to be? Somewhere between 10,000, okay. And it's probably going to be, once again, at a higher interest rate, so we'll make it 10%, also for 20 years. Okay. All right, so that's going to be $96.50. So in addition to this, we're going to have the private mortgage insurance. And let's say it's going to be equal to $50 a month. All right? Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay, so one of the things that we could do, before we try to complicate it up at all, is just simply to say, with those three elements, first loan, the primary loan, the secondary or junior loan, and the PMI, what would be our effective cost of borrowing for this loan? Does that make sense? Okay, so there, all we're going to do is we're going to take the 573.14 plus the 96.50 plus the $50 a month, add those three together. So we end up with a total of $719.64. So every month we're going to be coming out of pocket $719.64. Okay, does that make sense? Now, there are a couple of other little quirks in here that we've got to kind of deal with, and we'll maybe try to deal with that in a different way. But in essence, once the overall amount that you have borrowed drops below 80%, you no longer are required to pay the PMI, okay? But before we kind of get to that point, let's just sort of take a look at this as being our monthly payment, and then our total amount borrowed is $90,000, and our term is 20 years. And then solve for what's our cost of borrowing.
The 90,000 is adding the two loan amounts, right?
Yes, 90,000 just comes from adding the 80,000 to the 100,000. So what we end up with is a blended rate or an overall cost of borrowing of about 7.4%. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay. Now, how could we potentially complicate this up a little bit? What's right? Well, drop the PMI, but drop it after basically the balance drops below 80% or $80,000 overall. But if we wanted to sort of say the loan is potentially going to pay off after so many years, then we would need to do what? Just simply find the balance at the end of whatever period that might be. Like, for example, we can just simply say, assume that the seller or the buyer sells the property after 3 years. So at that point, we'd have to find the balance after 3 years in both instances and just simply plug that in as a future value and then resolve. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's really the only other thing we could do to kind of complicate this up.
But you wouldn't be able to find that on the whole, you'd have to do each piece individually.
You would.
Right, because they're gonna amortize differently.
Exactly. Okay. I mean, you want to do that or not? Okay. So, in this instance, let's just say it pays off, loan pays early. At end of year 3. Okay? So in this case, we're simply going to do 1 input 36, shift, amortize, equal, 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 get the balance there, do the same thing over here. Okay, first one. $73, 189, 16. And then 9449, 78. Okay, very good with that? All right, so now what we need to do is we need to add those two balances together. $82,638.94. Okay. Then we can just actually go over here and put right underneath all of this, we can put in 82,638.94 as our future value after 36 months, and then resolve for the interest rate. Okay? Now, do you need to go ahead and put this back in again? Yeah, because we've obviously worked on something since then. Okay? If you don't actually have to solve for the interest rate here, if you don't want to, it should work out just the same. But starting with 719.64, because that's the minimum stay constant. The 90,000 stays the same. 20 years. And I get 7.14. So you get?
So you put in 718 as the payment, you're doing that too?
Yep.
And then 82 to 36 or something, right?
Yep.
Do we need to do the whole process?
All you have to do is just start with 719.64, and then you can leave out the interest rate calculation here and just jump to this. But it shouldn't change your answer either way. Okay. All right.
No.
What? What, you're not getting that?
No.
Hold on, let me do it again.
So, we'll
Okay.
okay.
I'm getting no solution is.
Okay, you're not putting something in as a negative.
Yeah, that's what.
So
Which one?
basically make sure that you've got the payment as a negative, because that's a cash outflow to you. And then the payoff amount of $82,638.94 is also a negative, because that's also a payout.
So there's only 3 data inputs, the payment, the future value, and the number?
You start once again.
No, I'm just saying, there's only 3 things to input, right?
Well, no, okay, you've got your payment to input,
Right.
you've got your present value to input,
Okay, that's numbers.
you've got your term, you solve the interest rate, but you could actually just sort of leave out those 2 steps and just jump down to this one if you really wanted to.
So this is the effective cost of borrowing at the end of 3 years,
Correct.
regardless, because you stop paying.
Correct.
Basically, right?
Correct.
PMI is still embedded in there on that.
Right, because it's still good for that 3 years. Okay.
Getting all this.
Moving
Get
forward.
the one you got.
All right, next one. Loan refinancing. This is one of those things that everybody has a little bit of a different perspective on. As a general rule, you have to be very careful about whether or not you choose to refinance a property or not. And it depends on the kind of loan that you have, it depends on the lender you have, it depends on what the change of the interest rates are, it depends on what all the other conditions of the new loan are going to be versus the old loan. There's a lot of things that you have to sort of consider. I mean, I remember I've known people who every time, you know, the interest rate would drop just a tiny bit, would immediately rush to their lender, refinance the property. And sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. To a large extent, one of the big determining factors as to whether or not you should refinance a property or not is basically how long are you going to own it. If you only plan on owning a property for probably a couple of years, it's probably not going to make sense for you to refinance the property given all of the associated cost with the refinancing, okay? You know, once again, on a residential level, sometimes lenders are willing to go through and do a very quick refinance, and you know, there's not maybe a lot of brain damage associated with it. But on commercial refinancings, usually it's a bit more involved in that. Usually it's a situation of where you've got to go with that refinancing, get a brand new appraisal on the property, which is not cheap for commercial properties, okay? Even a relatively small, basic, plain, run-of-the-mill sort of appraisal is going to be several $1,000s, okay, for a commercial property. And the more complicated that it is going to be.
Do you want that one?
Okay. The more complicated the commercial property is, then the more expensive the appraisal is going to be. So you have to factor that in as part of the cost of the refinancing. On the residential side, as I said, typically it's a lot less expensive to do an appraisal, you know, a few $100s, not that big of a deal. But that's not the only cost, usually, of the refinancing. I mean, usually there are processing fees involved and other ancillary costs that you may have to undergo. And it may not always be with the same lender, okay? Just because you're refinancing the property doesn't mean that you're going to be sticking with the same lender on the refinance that you had on the original loan. So kind of keep it in the back of your mind. Okay, all of that having been said, let's take a look. All right, so assume we've got a property. How big of a mortgage we want to have? Let's say $500,000. All right, so $500,000 mortgage, and the interest rate that maybe you had on the mortgage was 8%. And let's say that mortgage was for 20 years. Okay, so let's start out. Go ahead and get the payment for that. Okay, $4,182.20. Okay, everybody match? Okay. Now, interest rates drop. So let's say they drop down to 7.5%, okay? So a 0.5% drop. What does that mean that your monthly payment would drop to? Well, just put in 7.5%, resolve for payment. $4,027.97. Okay? So let's see what the difference is between those two. The difference of $154.23 a month. Okay? Everybody cool with that? All right. Now, let's just do some kind of, just talk through this just a little bit. So, let's say that this is, once again, a roughly small commercial property. We're going to have an appraisal done, as I said, probably a couple $1,000s. Let's say that you're going to have, probably some additional fees and charges to get the new loan. So, all in all, let's just sort of round off a nice round number. It's going to probably be $5,000, I would bet, to probably go through everything you need to go through to get this refinanced. Okay, seem like a reasonable number? Okay, $5,000. So doing some simple math, without trying to involve any sort of time value of money here for a second, just looking at a simple payback period, okay? Taking that $5,000 of refinancing cost and dividing it by the monthly payment savings, how many months would we basically have to own this property before we sort of pay ourselves back? Does that make sense? Okay. So 5,000 divided by 154.23. So about 32.4 months to break even. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. I'm about to complicate it if you're asking.
No, it's
okay.
a simple question.
Okay.
I got lost on the where the 5,000 came from.
Okay, the 5,000 is basically what are our refinancing costs. It could be like a couple $1,000s for an appraisal, could be, another couple $1,000s for loan origination fees, could be another $1,000 or so for just other ancillary filing fees and courier fees, attorney fees, survey fees, whatever else, okay? But just a lump sum of $5,000 for refinance. Okay, so what we're saying here, so let's just kind of think this through for a second. What if our goal is to only own this property for maybe 3 more years? Is it worth the refinancing? Now, 3 requires a little bit of a judgment, obviously, because 3 years is 36 months, yes? Okay, so we're just saying that we get a simple payback after 32 months. So, if we're really thinking in the back of our mind, we're only going to own this thing for about 3 more years, it probably doesn't make any sense for us to refinance this. Does that make sense?
Theoretically, yes.
It might make a little bit,
but it's not worth the hassle.
but then you also have to factor in not only the $5,000 out of pocket, but what's my time worth?
Right.
Of going through, once again, all the brain damage to potentially, refinance this.
Right.
Now, we get a little further out in the future, we sort of say, okay, I'm planning on owning this thing for, 10 more years. Then yeah, it begins to make a bit more sense to probably go through the refinancing. But my point being is you have to kind of begin to sort of think through what that real, savings is going to be, over the time period you plan on owning the property. Well, another really simple calculation.
What about the period that you already been paying, for example, 2 years or 5 years?
Okay, and that's a good question. You've already been making payments for the past couple of years, and then you're now doing the refinancing, and that is going to sort of further complicate this a little bit, because you can't really do anything about those past payments.
Yeah.
They're done. whatever they may be. And so we're really just sort of forward looking, you know, from this point of just saying, what is going to be my cost savings kind of from this point forward. But let's just make the assumption, for simplicity for the moment, that the moment that we get this loan, we immediately refinance it, okay? And just from a maximum sort of savings perspective, how much would there be? So $154.23 per month. How long is the loan? 240 months, yes?
Yeah. But that's not real either.
I totally agree, and I'm getting to the complicated part, okay? So we start with this, 154.23 times 240. So over the life of this, the maximum savings would be $37,000 from the refinancing, okay? And but that is making the assumption that we got the loan today, and immediately after getting the loan today, the interest rates dropped by a half a point, or we found a new lender down the street that was willing to give us this half a point difference. We paid the $5,000 up front, we refinanced, and assuming we kept the property for the next 20 years, we would save ourselves $37,000 minus potentially the $5,000 of refinancing cost, so our net savings would be maybe around $32,000 in terms of actual cash money savings, not taking into account any sort of discounted, you know, sort of time value of money effects, just looking at this purely on a cash in, cash out basis, okay? That's where I want to start with this example. Does everybody understand? Yes? Okay. Now, part of what we also could do is to say, like Eduardo was suggesting, is that we've maybe actually had this loan for a couple of years. We've already been making payments for, you know, whatever, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it might be. You know, the balance is a little bit less. So at that point when we refinance, we're refinancing actually a lower dollar amount, which might actually even get us a better interest rate on top of things, because now it's a lower loan to value ratio. So there's a factor that we might want to consider. And then we would also probably want to say, well, you know, what is the discounted value of these savings? Well, if we sort of just simply took, just to kind of make the comparison, if we took the 154.23 as a payment savings, and we did that for the full 20 years to show the maximum effect, and we did it at the new interest rate of 7.5%, and we solve for the present value savings, the present value savings is about, 144.89.90. Okay, all right. So this is part of, I'm assuming part of Eduardo's point is that we're really not saving the full 37,015, you know, over that full 240 months. The discounted value of that savings, because of the interest rate that we're being charged, is really only worth in present value dollars to us about 19,000. So that makes the situation even a little bit more precarious in that we've got $5,000 of refinancing costs that we would have to pay up front. Does everybody follow what I'm saying? So, you know, from that standpoint, that refinancing decision of, you know, 32 months to break even is really not all that accurate, because we haven't discounted sort of those dollars. So if we sort of think of it, you know, in these terms, to kind of put it in perspective, if we were to put 5,000 in as our present value, and we put in 154.23 as our payment savings, and we put in this case, the interest rate of 7.5%, and we want to solve for what would be actually the discounted sort of break-even term. It actually kicks it up a little bit to 36.34 months. So earlier, whenever I asked the question, well, if we were going to hold this thing for basically 36 months, would it make sense to actually refinance? And Michael was saying, well, you know, maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, because, you know, technically. But after we actually look at it legitimately through the eyes of the discounted value of those dollars, the reality is, instead of 32 months to actually break even, it really is closer, actually a little bit more than 36 months to break even. Okay, so it adds another, 4 months or so onto that. All right, does that make sense? Now, all of that is just simply to say, the whole lesson that I'm really just trying to convey with the refinancing is, just think before you refinance, okay? That you've got to sort of at least do this sort of a basic analysis to determine whether or not it makes any sense to go through the refinancing process. Now, if the interest rate drops dramatically, sure, it may make sense, but then there's also another piece to this that we haven't even talked about. This is just, assuming it's kind of like you're going from one loan to another, same lender, same conditions, no other issues, barriers, strings attached, whatever. But think about this. With commercial lenders, we've talked about before, no two are the same, okay? And they all have different preconditions about things that they may require you to provide them on a regular, consistent basis. Historically, with commercial loans, whenever a lender made a loan, basically the only expectation was you made the payments back to them over the prescribed time period. As long as you made those payments, they left you alone, they never bothered you, you never bothered them, you made the payments. Very simple. Simple, straightforward relationship. What has happened within relatively recent history is that you've got lenders becoming much more proactive with respect to whenever they make a loan, in many cases there's more of an oversight. And part of the reason they can have that oversight is because of the technology that's now available to be able to monitor things that they weren't necessarily able to monitor before. So for example, assuming this is a commercial property, they can potentially monitor the bank accounts affiliated with this property and see what deposits are being made, what expenses are going out. So in other words, they can see whether or not your tenants are paying the rent. They can see, are they paying on time? What expenses do you have? Are they all of a sudden a little bit unusual? And begin to kind of monitor this. And many banks have what are called now surveillance departments that actually monitor this, especially for larger loans, okay? Well, it goes beyond that. What a lot of lenders also have begun to require, they used to, in some cases, require like annual sort of property operating statements, in other words, to see what is the income, what are the expenses, to kind of ensure that the property was going to perform at a certain level and would do a quick little review of that once a year. Now, in many cases, they've gone to requiring full-time access, like I said, to all of the accounts affiliated with the property, so that at any point in time, they can see what are the income streams, what are the expenses, and monitor that. And then if all of a sudden the ratios are sort of out of whack in terms of occupancy levels relative to expenses and things like that, they're going to say, okay, danger, danger, all of a sudden they need to just take a closer look at this, because it'll pop up on a watch report and say, okay, this property is potentially in danger of not meeting its financial obligations. So now we as the lender are going to step in under the guise of what is called a technical default. Not an actual default, but a technical default. An actual default on a loan is where you stop making payments. A technical default is whenever you don't meet some sort of provision of the loan documents, okay? Whatever that provision may very well be. So if all of a sudden your property drops below, let's say, 75% occupancy, the lender says, okay, the warning signs are now sort of, up. We have seen you've dropped below 75%, you're now at a 70% occupancy level. What do we want to do about it? Do we want to step in and potentially assume managerial control of the property? Do we want to step in and basically say that any and all new leases have to be approved and signed by us? We want to step in and potentially require some sort of an additional sort of cash call to ensure that everything is going to be okay. So you get the perspective of what I'm talking about, that no two lenders are really the same. You have the old school lenders that are probably going to charge you a higher rate of interest, and then they'll probably leave you alone, but then the new school lenders, to a certain extent, may charge you a much lower interest rate, but then have all these additional requirements that you've got to be aware of and comply with. Does that make sense?
It is not for the lender to decide, right?
What do you mean?
If I want to keep going with 70% or 65%.
It is if that is one of the provisions of the loan documents. But within the loan documents, there could be a number of stated criteria that you must maintain in order to be in good standing with the lender. If you fall below whatever those standards are, then the lender has the right, not necessarily the obligation, but has the right to step in and potentially take over managerial control in some form or fashion with the property. It potentially goes into a situation of where it moves from a traditional servicing arrangement into what's called a special servicing arrangement. And under that special servicing arrangement, you have people that are going to then be more closely monitoring the performance of it to ensure that it doesn't get worse. Because obviously the last thing the lender wants is for the property to continual, sort of downward slide. So what they may say is, all right, look, the property is clearly going downhill for whatever reasons. We're going to stop, we're going to step in, we're going to exert managerial control. You've got a couple of choices. Either you sell the property now, so that we can take us out of it, or potentially you have to infuse some additional equity into the property in order for us to stay happy. Does that make sense? Okay.
What common criteria for that?
Yeah, and remember, if you were to pretty much Google, sort of commercial loan provisions, you're probably going to see, a number of very specific criteria. Everything from maintaining a certain debt coverage ratio, to maintaining a certain occupancy, to maintaining a certain expense ratio relative to income, to potentially requiring that any and all new leases with new tenants be pre-approved by the lender, to, there's literally almost anything that your brain can think of, a lender has probably done. All in the guise of protecting themselves. Because think of it like this. Think of yourself as a lender for a second, and you're loaning, here to Carlos, and you want to make sure that whatever Carlos is doing with that property is not only in his best interest, but obviously in your best interest in terms of you getting whatever cash flow that you were expected to get. Now, you don't want to necessarily have to step in and take control of Carlos's property, but if all of a sudden Carlos's properties aren't performing that well, you're going to get really nervous because you don't want to end up with a bunch of his properties on your hands that you've got to dispose of. So instead, you try more of like an early intervention to potentially try to maybe wrest away control, or at least have a substantive conversation with him about, okay, what's going on? Let's take a look at this. Why are your occupancy levels dropping? We need to kind of get a handle on this. Now, chances are Carlos is already aware of this, but the typical response by a lot of owners is to cover it up, to kind of sweep all the bad news under the carpet, and then it's too late at some point to be able to actually then do anything substantive to be able to control the fallout.
Well, I guess also the question is, Class C properties, first-time borrowers, or is it just depends on
Well, it depends on the lender.
the lender?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain types of lenders that, once again, are much more sort of proactive in this than others. Okay, moving on. Biweekly payments. So one of the things that you potentially can do, your lender will typically, like for example, for those of you that get paid twice a month, all right? Your lender may say, all right, instead of setting up your mortgage payment as a once a month transaction, we'll set it up every 2 weeks, okay, as a biweekly transaction. Does that make sense? All right, so the reality is it might save you a little bit of money, but not as much as one might think, okay, over the life of the loan. But let's just go ahead and kind of work through the mechanics of it. So let's say we've got a $100,000 loan. Whoops, not a million, 100. All right. And once again, 10% interest rate. Let's say the loan term is 15 years, and we get our payment. Okay? Versus a bi-weekly payment would be how many times a year? 26. Okay? Because 52 weeks in a year. Okay? So you do 26 payments per year for $100,000, 10%. Okay, start off with this. Okay, so our payment here, $1,074.61. Payment over here is going to be $495.49, but we're making that payment 26 times, which would be $12,882.83, whereas over here, this one is being made 12 times a year. $12,895.32. So you can actually see the difference between the two just over 1 year. It's only $12.49 savings from doing the bi-weekly, but it's $12.49. I mean, so I'm just going to be presenting this. So the reality, I guess, of the message here is you're not really going to save that much by doing bi-weekly payments on your mortgage in terms of the interest savings per year. However, it may be more convenient for you, just from the standpoint of having it done twice a month. Okay, so that was a really simple one. Okay, any questions? All right. Effective cost of 2 loans. All right, so this is quite similar to what we talked about in terms of basically the effective cost of borrowing. Here, all we're really doing is just simply saying we've got 2 loans and we're combining the 2 loans. So instead of them being separate loans and we're looking at the incremental cost, here we're just simply saying we've got maybe one mortgage and we've got another mortgage on the same property. Boom, we add them together and see what the effective cost is of those 2 loans together. So let's say that we've got a $100,000 loan. And it's at a 10% interest rate for 15 years. So we get our monthly payment on that one. Make sure your calculator set back to 12 payments per year. 1074.61. Okay, and then we have another loan on the same property, and let's say that the other loan is a $150,000 loan, all right, also 12 payments per year, all right, and this one happens to be, let's say, at a 7% interest rate, also for 15 years. So we're going to solve for the monthly payment for that one. Okay, so let's do that real quick. All right, so our monthly payment there is $1348.24. So what we're going to do is we're going to add those two payments together. So the combined payments for the two loans are going to be $2422.85. Okay. Now, real simply, to get the effective cost of for the two loans combined, we would simply put in the $2422.85 as a negative payment amount for the 15-year term, and the combined loans would be $250,000 as our present value, and then our solution is simply going to be solving for the interest rate, or in this case, the effective cost of borrowing for those two loans combined. So let's do that real quick, and we'll be done. So we end up with the loans combined, the effective cost of borrowing is going to be 8.23% for the two loans being merged together. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, all right. So what we're going to do, we're going to pick up the other topics probably at the beginning of next week. We may have to postpone one of our quizzes and the next test, but we'll deal with that. Okay, so at this point, let me go ahead and kind of go ahead and take a quick 2-minute break. We're going to come back and we have a guest speaker, Mike Riley. Mike, are you going to use any of the...
Just the whiteboard.
Okay, let me just go ahead and turn this off. How are you? Good. Same here. So do you think it's pretty efficient in and out?
Research done on how long can the students sit before they have to get up and not get too bored. But you didn't say I was wrong.
This class will be about 16 people. Yeah, those are those. So we're about halfway through it. First 8 weeks of this semester is just English, geographic information systems, and then the second half of the semester we're taking mostly finance,
I thought you were supposed to be
over the
8
years,
years.
16 weeks they're taking online market analysis class.
I don't know, I haven't talked about
So technically all of them right now, or most of them, mostly finance course, financial modeling course, tomorrow market analysis class.
I don't think we have to have a meeting per se at this point. I think what we need to do is agree on some basic steps we need to reach an agreement as to how much time we're going to put into
Yeah.
doing a little bit of
That's
research.
what I want to know, yeah. No, and what we can do is establish a goal and delegate the process.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
How many times of subscribers do we have?
Just see what we want and just spread out. between those three.
And Professor Samigel also said something about he's going to take a vacation. The number that he's going to.
Australia.
Oh, it's gonna take us.
He's going to take a little vacation. He's funny, man. You never met him.
No, no,
He's like, very smart man.
that's it.
Yeah.
You ready for this?
As ready as I can be.
Huh?
As ready as you can be.
Exactly. Yeah, 19. Yeah, this is small.
Yeah, but 1941, not 1941.
Just starting to figure out how to do it. Technology is, the real estate business is obviously, I guess, it wasn't don't forget, you got a lot of creators around there.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. So this morning, as I mentioned to you previously, and then also this morning, Pike Rowley, who is with Avis & Young, he serves on our MSRED advisory board and has done so for the past few years. He's asked to come in and talk to you guys for a little while, and so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pike.
Okay, thank you, Fred, appreciate it. So, I don't know how often you get folks to come in and speak to you about what area of the industry that they're in, but I'm in the commercial real estate industry, right? So some of you are, I'm curious, I'm going to ask actually to see why you all are taking this program and what your aspirations are, and what you're hoping to do for a living, you know, once you have this degree. But my area of expertise is the commercial real estate business, right? So what you'll find in the next hour of the things that I talk about and the things that I say, I like to communicate in a very simple way, right? Very simple way. I like to always want to know the why behind what I'm doing, the why behind what I'm studying. And so the commercial real estate business, very simply described, is really about four walls and a roof that produces income. Okay, so if you think about what I'm going to show you today with the service company that I run in Florida, is we are service providers, which is another way of saying we're advocates. And we're advocates for folks who are in our sandbox called commercial real estate. And the commonality is that the product that we're circling and touching and playing in has four walls and a roof and produces income. It could be an apartment complex, it could be a shopping center, it could be an industrial building, it could be an office building. That's the commonality. That's the game that we're playing in. So that's my role. Now, you may have people that come in here and tell you that they're building homes, or they're doing other things with land, but my world is the CRE, and you'll see those initials a lot when you get into our game. CRE is basically the commercial real estate business. I'm going to pass out a one-page flyer that I extracted from one of our pitch books, which basically describes what our company does, and I think it'll help color. Just pass these around if you would, and leave the excess at the end of the table, and I'll pick up the excess later. This sort of describes what our services are. See there, we've got plenty here. Not really good. Right. All right. So before before I get started, I'm just curious if I could get some volunteers to raise their hand and tell me what's the driver behind you wanting to get this degree, this master's degree? What are your aspirations? What are you hoping that you're going to end up using this degree for? Any volunteers?
I've been a financial controller in a property management company for the
Okay.
last 7 years. So
Okay.
I'm using this to get into that COO, CFO kind of role.
Okay, great.
I just graduated undergrad, so I'm looking to jumpstart a career in real estate development.
Real estate development, okay?
Commercial real estate investment and eventually development.
Okay. You know they're one and the same, right?
Yeah.
One is buying existing developed product, and the other is going ground up. At the end of the day, they're the same. One is a hell of a lot more risk, right? And the other is, you know, so as long as we're talking in the same vocabulary. Anybody else? What are your aspirations?
I'm a commercial real estate broker, and I got into learn more about the theory and become better at it.
Right. Okay. Anybody else? One more. Just curious if I want to tap in all of the brains in the room.
To manage some investments from Brazil.
Okay.
Friends from Brazil.
Okay, great. How about you?
We are trying to do transfer of portfolio from another country. So I'm trying to learn what is the American system of doing commercial
Okay.
or residential real estate. So I thought this would be a good
Good.
start to get knowledge.
Good, good. Okay. Now I kind of get a feel for my audience. So I'm sure most of you have heard of the companies called CBRE, Jones Lang LaSalle, Cushman & Wakefield. Those are my competitors. They pretty much do what we do. Avis & Young is a little further down the list because we're not quite as big. We're privately held, we're not publicly held. And it's a very different dynamic, right, as to what kind of drives you and what kind of pushes you out into the game. My background is as a broker. So in the old days, if I went to work for CBRE or JLL or Cushman & Wakefield, I'd have to choose, you know, one area of expertise that I wanted to work in, right? And in my expertise, it just happened to kind of defaulted into it, was office leasing. And most of my office leasing was done on the landlord side of the equation. And in some instances, I've represented the tenant. But that's kind of my sandbox. And I think what you'll discover as you look at this handout that I gave is that you have all these different areas that are now encompassed within a commercial real estate brokerage company. So when you hear the term real estate brokerage with the bigger shops, it's not just about leasing, and it's not just about selling. It's about all these services that are on this sheet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of give you a sampling of when would somebody hire our company to do all of these things, right? Now this is a menu of services that we offer when we go in to pitch somebody to hire us. This is just pulled out of our pitch package as a menu of services that they can choose one or they can choose them all. So what I'm going to try to do this morning is give you an example of who would choose all of these, which would be, you know, my new hero, right? Because they're going to give us the maximum amount of fees possible. So I'm going to describe for you a meeting with an imaginary meeting with Bill Gates, sitting on his yacht in the Bahamas, and somehow or other I got invited into his audience. And somehow or other he thinks that I'm going to be a great advocate for him to go help him develop a 100,000 square foot office building somewhere in South Florida. So he's choosing the size, the 100,000. He's choosing the product type, which is office, and he's choosing the geography, which is South Florida. And for whatever reason, he thinks I can help him pull this off. And I'm going to be his advocate, right? So I need a volunteer who's pretty quick with a calculator that can run the numbers that I throw out. Who would that be? Our controller? I'm glad you volunteered. Okay.
More like voluntold.
So the first thing on our list is that I've got to go find a broker to find a piece of land for me, right? So I'm going to need a piece of dirt that's going to accommodate 100,000 square foot of office. Now, I don't want to buy a larger piece, and I don't want to I don't want to put other products on this piece. I don't want to buy a bigger piece and put in retail or self-storage or apartments. You're hearing a lot of mixed use thrown around out there, okay? This client is not asking for that. One building, 100,000 square feet, South Florida. That's all I have to go on so far. So now as his advocate, what I want to do is I want to find, preferably in a perfect world, a corner of an intersection. And the reason I want to find a corner at an intersection is because now I can go back to my client and say, I got you a very highly visible piece of property. And I got you a very highly accessible piece of property, right? Now in the office game, what we're trying to shoot for is close to transportation so that employees can come and go rather easily, close to residential where the employees can live and commute with not too far of a commute. And visibility so clients can actually find this building if they have to go to a meeting, right? Or if you're a CPA, if you're a lawyer, if you're a stockbroker and you got a client coming to visit you, it'd be nice if they could figure out how to find your building rather easily. And then of course the accessibility to the site is also helpful. So I was very fortunate way back years ago in my career to be the first broker to lease office space in the city of Weston. And I'm telling you, when I was doing this, I think it was late 80s, 595 was just finishing up, right? And you had to take State Road 84 to get to Weston back in the pioneer days, right? And so we were putting up an office building, and I literally had a pediatrician sit in front of me saying, well, I'm going to be the first pediatrician in this town. Do you think I'm going to be successful? Well, of course, looking forward, he killed it, right? Because he was pioneering in a town where everybody wanted to live. So the reason Weston was such an amazing story, we not only put up one, but various clients of mine ended up putting several office buildings up there. And that's kind of how I lucked into making my mark in the industry. I was the office leasing guy for Weston. If you wanted to lease office space in Weston, if you wanted to develop an office building in Weston, you called me, because I knew it inside and out. But think about what that town had. It had transportation with 595, Sawgrass Expressway, I-75. You had an interchange there that was amazing, and people could get there rather quickly. As a matter of fact, I had attorneys that were leasing an office space there that told me they could get to downtown Miami, where their headquarters was. They could get there downtown Miami faster from Weston than they could from South Miami or Pinecrest, right? Just because of the commute. So we had a lot of things going for us. Plus, it was a great bedroom community for the executives to live. And if any of you are ever going to get in the office game and you want to know the driver behind why a tenant leases space in a building, because the decision maker probably lives pretty close by. The decision maker is probably rolling out of bed to go to his office building within a mile of where his house is. So you can read all the research you want and all the deep dives you want, but that's kind of what drives that. All right, so Bill Gates says, find me a site. Now, I've decided that I'm going to buy Mr. Gates this piece of property on this intersection in South Florida that's near, either 75 or 595. Hopefully it's not near 95, because 95 is ridiculous to drive on. I drive on it every day. But let's assume that we're going to buy the site. Can anybody tell me what size piece of property I need to buy this 100,000 square foot office building? Anybody taking any courses on site coverage ratio yet? Okay. So a site coverage ratio is the ratio of the 100,000 square feet to the site, right? And so a rule of thumb, and that's not in every city in South Florida, and that's not in every county in South Florida, but the rule of thumb is that you should have about a 25% site coverage for your office building to go on, right? So if you think about it, I'm going to put 4 stories on this site, and I'm going to build a Class A office building, and so I'm going to need 400,000 square feet of dirt. How do I figure out how many acres that is? Anybody can tell me that?
43,560.
43,560 is 1 acre.
Yes.
How many are going to be? So what's 400,000 divided by 43,560? How many acres? Should be about 9-ish.
Yeah.
9.18. So I got to buy 9.18 acres. Now, when you're talking about office space, that's going to be expensive, right? And so we're not really talking about price per acre. Now, if I'm a home builder and I need to buy 1,000 acres, my metrics, my standard of measurement is price per acre. When you start getting into office, retail, industrial space, your metric is price per square foot, right? So I'm going to buy 400,000 square feet, and I'm going to just throw out a guesstimate that that number is probably about $15 per square foot. How much is that? 6. Shouldn't have a calculator for that, right? I'm going to spend $6 million for the land. Now, if you look at your handout, Bill Gates hired me, and I went to my audience of players in my company, and I found a broker who's very proficient in land. He knows the values of land. He knows that of all the land opportunities, of all the 400,000 square foot or 9.1 acre sites that are out there available for sale, he's going to direct me to the right one that would be the highest and best use for office space, right? So a good land broker who specializes in land and wakes up every day thinking about land, understands entitlements, understands zoning, and understands that just because something is zoned for office space doesn't necessarily mean by the time you get into that city commission and get your approval for a site plan that you're going to get what you want. And hopefully you'll learn a lot about that whole approval process. But it's not for the faint of heart, because there's non-real estate people sitting on that city commission who want to see exotic trees and exotic flowers and 5,000 bicycle racks and just crazy stuff that don't make any sense for a real estate developer, right? That's just the nature of the game that we're now in. 50 years ago, you could buy any site, any zoning, put up an office building, and you go. Today, it's a very different game. So this land broker better know his sites, his valuation, and he better know the flavor of the month for that city commissioner, that planning and zoning board, or the likes and dislikes. There's a rule of thumb for a developer. You never walk in to a planning and zoning meeting or a commission meeting unless you have every vote sitting behind that desk. So they're going in and meeting with those people one-on-one to get their buy-in before they ever walk in with that presentation. Because if you walk in cold, you got a low chance of walking out of there with an approval. And that's just part of, I'm sure if you've had land planning attorneys come in here, that's what they do for a living, is they figure out how to lobby those folks to get what they want. Okay, so now we've hired this land broker, and he's found this great piece of property, and the zoning is right, the use seems to line up, and we've got a land planning attorney to help us get the approvals to build this thing. And here are just a couple of things to watch out for. Before I can go to Mr. Gates and get his check for $6 million to buy this site, I better do a little bit of homework for him on this site. And so I now am going to ask my development advisory guy, okay, he's really a true developer, and Fred, I think you know this, but Eric Swanson now works for our company. So Eric and I worked together once upon a time at a development company. And so in the old days, the developer, the one with all the development skills, only worked for developers, which meant that they were in the equity business. They were in the risk business. They were in the business of raising the equity and raising the debt and going at risk and being risk developers. Well, now that same guy is working for our company, and we're a service provider. We're not writing checks to invest in anything. We are service providers. We are advocates. You know, Mr. Gates is the guy writing the check. Mr. Gates is the guy going at risk. So my development expert with all the credentials and all the experience of going at risk is now a pure fee-driven service provider. So now our development guy is getting involved, and he's the one who's working with this land broker and making the decision to buy this site. And he's the one who's talking to the land use attorney, who in this area is the guy. And one of the things you'll find out is there are 15, 20 land use attorneys that you could hire for, and let's just use, I don't know, City of Davie, right? I want to build an office building in the City of Davie, right here. There's really one guy that has played in this sandbox in Davie over and over and over again, and has a very good track record of winning. That's the guy you look for, right? So my development guy is going to get the right land use attorney here, right? Because if I find a land use attorney that's a great attorney in Miami and has no clue what goes on in the City of Davie, it's not going to help me, right? So my development guy is going to make sure we can get approved for what we want to build. And then he's going to talk to an architect and civil engineer to figure out what's going on with the soil here, right? If this thing is full of sand, it's going to cost a fortune, or muck, stupid stuff that we've got to go in and spend all this site work, right? Are there any infrastructure around this thing? Do we have water and sewer and utilities going to the site? So all those things the development guy has to figure out. The other thing the development guy has to figure out is he's got to figure out that if the client wants to build 100,000 square feet, he's got to figure out the hard and soft costs for building that building, right? Now, let me just time out here for a minute. Because I'm a broker and because I understand values of things in my sandbox, I know where I got $15 from because I trade in that area, right? If I start throwing out numbers for hard and soft costs for building a building that don't make any sense at all, you have to forgive me. It's not what I do. It's not my specialty. I just hired a young lady that graduated from Florida State's undergrad real estate program. And 30 days afterwards, I sat her down, and she said, I've learned more in 30 days than I did in 4 years at FSU. It's not a slam on FSU. It's not a slam on the professors. It's not a slam on the curriculum. What is she really saying? She's saying that I got this world of education in 4 years, but what you guys do is this little tiny corner, right, called brokerage, and specifically leasing, and specifically office. And in 30 days, that's all I've been doing every single day, 9 hours a day. Office, 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 leasing, leasing, leasing. Of course she's going to know more in that 30-day period because we extracted one little piece from that program. And so that's kind of where I'm going with you all today, is I'm just extracting one piece from a very big world. So our development guy has signed off that 15 bucks per square foot, 6 million, is a good number for this site because his preliminary homework has determined that there isn't a lot of site work to do, there's not a lot of infrastructure work to do, there's not a lot of legal maneuvering and land planning to do, so we've got a good number there. Now, if any of those things weren't there, he may have to come back and say, hey guys, you need to pay 10 bucks for this site. Because you got a lot more money to spend to get this site ready to go to put up a building. So now we're going to put up a building, and again, I'm just throwing out numbers like I know what I'm talking about. Let's say the development guy
100,000-foot, four-story office building.
$200 a square foot.
How much?
For building costs, $200 a square foot.
200, I like that number. You know why? 'Cause it's round. All right, so 200 bucks. Numbers, man, what's 200 times 100,000 square feet? You shouldn't need a calculator. I don't need it.
You shouldn't either.
What do we got?
Then to
20 million?
20, yeah, 20 million.
20 million? All right, so we got $20 million of hard and soft costs to put this building up. And we paid $6 million for the dirt. Now we're into this baby for $26 million. How much square foot am I into this office building for so far? If it's 100,000 square feet, looks like I've got $260 a square foot. And again, I haven't even done anything yet. This is all just pro forma. This is all what you know, you're going to be learning some of this stuff in the finance class, right? Because the developer has a finance an analyst, you know, sitting right next to him. And his analyst is running all these numbers. Now, the analyst doesn't know what 200 bucks means, right? He's just being given the assumptions, right? And he doesn't know what $15 a foot. He's just given the assumptions. So the analyst is saying, okay, 260 bucks is my all-in to put this building up, right? And then as you were, I think I overheard some financing going on here. So now the development guy is going to his debt equity individual inside the same company, right? And this individual is not only proficient at knocking on the doors of lenders to get debt, but he also may be proficient at knocking on the Steve Gates, the Bill Gates doors of the world, who are the equity piece, right? So the reason I told you that Gates was sitting on a yacht is because the operative word there is passive, right? A passive investor basically just says, send me a check and send me a report. Don't ask me any questions, right? Just tell me how much money you need from me. Tell me what kind of return I'm going to get on my investment. And I hope you know what you're doing, and I hope you're honest. Go do it, right? That's a passive investor. So anyway, we've now got a $26 million project. We've got a $260 square foot deal. And remember, these are benchmarks, right? So if Gates knew anything about the real estate business, and I went over to the Bahamas and I said, okay, we found your piece of dirt for you. I need $6 million to close it. And now he's got $6 million into the deal. And I need you to be prepared for a $26 million all-in investment. He may finance some of that. He may pull it out of his CD, right? But this is the benchmark. So if he knows anything about being in the, you know, he's the one who drove this game to go buy an office building, right? So if I told him we're going to be into this thing for 260 bucks, there's a benchmark there, right? Because the rental rate, the rental rate that we have to lease this office building for is now, I'm skipping over project management and I'm going to leasing, because now, before I put this building up, I got to sit down with a leasing broker. And I got to ask this leasing broker, in this intersection, in this city, and this type of building, what kind of rental rate can you get for this product? Okay? So what I think that broker's going to say is that I can get $20 a square foot net. And I didn't come here today to explain the difference between a net lease and a gross lease, but let's just assume that when I say net, that the tenant is paying for all of the operating expenses that it takes to run this building, okay? And so taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, we pass all that on to the tenant. But what the tenant ends up paying me, that I put in my pocket, is $20. Anything else he's paying to outside vendors through my help. So we've got a $20 a square foot net pro forma, and when we take $20 times 100,000 square feet, what do we get? $2 million of net revenue. So now, what I'm telling my investor is that when I lease this building up full 100%, I've got a $2 million potential NOI, right? Well, if I'm going to fill this building up with multiple tenants, I'm probably never going to be at 100% all the time. So if I hold this thing for 10 years, you know, the first couple of years are going to be, you know, 100% vacant, to 50% occupied, to 75% occupied, all the way up to hopefully we get to a stabilized occupancy of about 90%.
You put 100,000, shouldn't that be 400,000?
Where?
Because that's the square feet, that's the total square feet of build-up area that you're building?
No, I'm building a 100,000 square foot office building. I had to buy 400,000 feet of dirt.
Oh,
It's my land size.
I thought it was the other way around. All right.
Yeah, so this is my land size, and this is my building size, right? So, of course, the investor has stars in his eyes, and he's thinking, this is great. I'm gonna shell out $26 million, and I'm gonna get $2 million back, right, and net return, right? So if I invest $26 million and I get a $2 million net return back, what's that?
9.5%.
That's a 9.5% return.
Very good.
So those of us in the business know that's not a realistic number. And it's not realistic for a lot of reasons. But it is a cap rate, right? So capitalization rate is forgetting debt, just all in $26 million, and forgetting vacancy, forgetting holding period, and all those great things, just back of the envelope, $2 million on a $26 million investment, 9.5% return. Well, right away, Mr. Gates is saying, if I leverage this thing at 75% loan to value, and I go out looking for debt to put on this building, anybody have a feel for kind of interest rates that a lender might give me on something like this? About 5?
Maybe lower because it's not the higher, maybe you get 3%,
Yeah.
because the amount is higher.
So if I show up with a fully leased building, right,
Yeah.
with General Motors as my tenant for 100% of the building, I might get 3.5, right?
Yeah.
But let's just use 5 just because it's round. So very quick math in my head before I ever pulled out my calculator. 9.5% is a potential number, and 5%, right? So I'm seeing, you know, 450 basis points in my dreams, right? Not going to be there. But I'm just giving you a feel. But these players are really the ones who are throwing this around. Now, when we show up to Mr. Gates' yacht, we're not showing up with $2 million, and we're not showing up with 9.5%. We're coming in with a realistic pro forma. And the realistic pro forma is that we're going to put this building up day one, and it'll probably have 0 tenants, right? So while we're holding on to this building, we're paying property taxes, we're paying insurance, we're paying maintenance. We've got a lot of money going out the door before we ever start leasing this thing up. If I can pre-lease any of it, I'm a hero. But we're going to give him the worst case scenario. You're not going to see any income from this thing for 6 months. And then 6 months, we'll gradually start leasing this thing up. So the $2 million is not realistic for that reason. There's a holding period, there's a lease-up period. But at the end of the day, he's basically telling us, I'm prepared to hold on to this building for 10 years. Right? Okay. Now, let's figure out, now the leasing team is starting to go out there and they're starting to lease this building. Now, a lot of their presentations are for a fantasy building that's not out of the ground yet. So they've got pretty architecturals, they've got pretty renderings, they've got these packages, and they're out there talking to companies and to tenant rep brokers about their companies. Come lease space in this building because, and they list all the reasons why they should do it. So if they can get any leases signed before the building goes up, then it's pretty amazing. And that was one of the things that was pretty cool about Weston. We were able to pre-lease buildings in Weston because of the dream. It was a great story, it was a great presentation, and it was a great location. So now we've got the leasing team in there. Now we've got a lease signed, right? And we got the building up, because remember, the development guy is in the game, and now we've got to start putting tenants in this building. And take a look on your sheet, where does the project manager come in? The project manager, sometimes it's hard to differentiate between the project manager and the developer, but the project manager typically works for the developer. And the project manager is kind of the orchestra leader, right? So he's the guy that wants to make sure all these musicians are on the same page. So the project manager has an architect he has to deal with to design the tenant space. He's got a general contractor that he has to deal with, who in turn has to deal with all these subs to get the space put in there, right? So they design the space, they permit the space, they start putting up the studs, they start putting up the walls, and they start getting into the electrical, plumbing, and the above ceiling work. Now my project manager is overseeing the construction of these tenant spaces, right? Now he also may have been the guy on the site every day, making sure the GC who put up the building was doing a good job. So some project managers are proficient at that ground up piece. Others are more proficient on the interior, the tenant improvement piece. But my project manager is now in there. And so remember, we said we're going to spend $200 a square foot, not only to build the building, but the interior too, right? The tenant improvements, right? For all these tenants that are going in there. And so we're the ones that gave our client this $260 square foot number. This is where the developer is, right? That project manager better do a good job, because if there's cost overruns, our client sitting on that yacht is going to eat it. And all of a sudden, my $260 number or my $200 number starts looking pretty bad. So we've got to make sure we come in on time and on budget. My role as a leasing agent in this sandbox was that I better know the lease document inside and out. I better know the rights of the landlord, and I better know the rights of the tenant, because we have an obligation. Can anybody tell me why a purchase and sale contract is shorter in volume than a lease contract? Anybody know why that might be?
It's just a one-time thing.
Bingo.
In and out.
Bingo. Sales contract is done. It's over. We closed. Right? I've got no covenants. I've got no obligations. I've got no promises. You know, if I'm the seller and you bought it, have a nice life. I'm gone. A lease contains a lot of promises, a lot of covenants that go for the duration of that period of time. So a lot of leases are 5 and 10 years in term, and both parties have promises that they have to make. I once was doing my first lease, and it was to a doctor for 1,200 square feet. And in my world, 1,200 square feet is not a big space. And in my world, I don't want to offend anybody who has physicians as family members, but in my world, leasing space to the medical community is really hard, because they're convinced they're a hell of a lot smarter than you are, and they let you know it very quickly. And I had this doctor on the hook for 6 months. I could not get this guy to sign this lease. I finally brought him into my mentor, who's a developer, and he sat down, and he said, "Doctor, are you ready to sign the lease?" He says, "Well, I'd kind of like to have my attorney take one more look at it." He goes, "Well, let me read the lease for you." And he grabs the lease away from the guy, and he starts flipping through it page by page.